been able to wash my car or roll the window up to lock it in about a year's time. Diagnosis? Probably a faulty window crank, and it's otherwise known as a regulator. I've never done this type of work before, but I decided to give it a shot. I didn't know if the regulator in my car was fixable, so I figured better have one just in case. I found a spare driver's side door on the internet, so we drove the 4 hours to go pick it up. After spraying some penetrating fluid, I took the regulator out, which I'll show later in the video, and I got an extra hand crank as well. I took the hand crank with me when I went to pick up the donor door, just to make sure the regulator inside was working. The eBay hand crank came from Thailand. Apparently there's a thriving scene down there for these cars. The regulator I pulled out looked okay. I mean, pretty grungy for 43 years of dirt and grime and no maintenance, but it seems to be working. I soaked it down with engine degreaser and then started to clean it up. The degreaser alone made it work so much smoother. To my eyes, the plastic pieces on the regulator looked okay, so I left them in place. I used the Q-tip to get rid of the remaining grunge in the gears. I washed it down with soapy water, let it dry, then used white lithium grease on all the moving parts. Looks really messy, but it worked well. Really easy to move. I was most nervous about this stuff, removing brittle 43-year-old plastic without breaking it. The latch, the crank, the handle, and then the entire door card would have to come off. These pieces are really hard to find. I practically memorized a few pages out of the body manual so I wouldn't screw this up. First step, I disconnected the battery so the courtesy light wouldn't run it down. Let's start with the easy one first, the door latch. Just one screw. So you pull the latch open, you make sure you're also unlocked, and while you're lifting out, you pull left and then right. This pops like this.
You got it?
The trick was just being patient and careful on that really thin piece of plastic right next to the lock switch. The window crank is held in place by a horseshoe-shaped pin. You want to take an object and push up on that pin. I tried a piece of metal wire. It almost worked. The end of a forked trim removal tool worked great.
It wants to snap off, it just bounces back. I got it.
With the latch and window crank off, the door handle was the last to go. You gotta remove this trim piece to get to the last screw. And again, the forked trim tool was the best I had to not damage it when I was taking it off. It's interesting looking at the materials they used, over 40 years ago to build these cars. Old vinyl is easy to damage, and I was kind of worried about taking off the door card. Because I had bought that spare door, I knew where the clips were. Now, since I didn't know exactly what I was going to need, I bought a bunch of trim removal tools. These two were the most useful when it came to taking off the door card without damaging it. I started at the corner next to the courtesy light. I gently squeezed in the clip removal tool, and it was easier than I thought. No sound of ripping cardboard or vinyl. These Toyota clips are made of metal, and they were pretty strong. I had read online about plastic clips snapping using a pry tool, but these metal clips did pretty good with the broad, flat pry tool that I used. A gentle lift, and off it came. I needed to be careful because the wires were still attached to the courtesy light. I marked one set with tape so I knew what was what, and they came apart without a problem. So that's what those clips look like, and you're prying on top of the metal and not below it. So you can see that movement isn't translating to the window regulator at all, so it's got to come out. So there's 6 bolts that hold the window regulator to the door. And you can see kind of where they line up on the regulator itself. There are 2 bolts that hold the window to the regulator. The glass has those metal bits at the end, and that's how it attaches to the regulator. After putting a bit of oil and everything, I marked bolt number 1 and 2. These ones slide up and down, and they level the glass so your window is in line with the body. You just mark it till you put the bolts back in the same place. Since my pre-existing regulator is just loose in the door, we grabbed the glass and lowered it slowly to the 2 holes in the door where you can access the bolts that hold the glass to the regulator. So the first step basically is to take out the glass. Once the bolts were removed, we just pulled up on the window halfway, and I figured I could get the regulator out and put the new one in without having to remove the window all the way. I'm sure there's other ways to do it, but I didn't want to risk breaking the glass. So we took out all 6 bolts, and the regulator just fell to the bottom of the door, and that spring just flipped right out of it. I gently pulled the regulator out of the door, and we just kept the window suspended. It wasn't too bad. And by too bad, I mean I wasn't the one who had to hold up that window for half an hour. Alright, time for the new one to go in. Now to get all the holes to line up, I had to attach the window crank it, so the piece would line up with the door. By piece, I mean that thing in red. Now that wasn't too bad, but this next part was pretty fiddly. Lining up the regulator to bolts 1 and 2, we did it, but it probably took 10 minutes of fidgeting. With the regulator in place, last step, lower the glass and attach the glass to the regulator. Jen finally had a break from holding the glass, and that's when I discovered that we screwed it up. When we lowered the glass down, we didn't line it up into that track that you can see in yellow. We left the regulator in place, took out the 2 bolts holding the window in, raised it, lowered it back, and then finally a working window. Awesome. I used white lithium grease to lubricate the track where the window sits. Now the body manual said there's supposed to be a vapor barrier there, but I didn't find any, so I decided to make my own. I started by cleaning up the door, all the old tar, by using degreaser and then alcohol. I just went to the hardware store, picked up a couple different sizes of polyvinyl plastic sheeting, and the 6mm was pretty good. Easy to work with, not too thin, not too thick. I cut out a rough size and used photography gaff tape, which is kind of a non-residue sticky tape, to affix it to the window inside of the door. I used the Celica body manual just to figure out where they liked the vapor barrier to go and typically where they applied their sealant. Now, to seal the vapor barrier to the door, my first choice was a 3M product. I couldn't get a hold of it, so I found this Beetle seal tape on Amazon. People were using this to seal up stuff on their RVs, and some guys had used this on their doors, and it seemed to work pretty well. So generally, you're staying inside of the door clips, and above those thin metal slips where the wires come through at the bottom of the door. And you can see that crappy speaker hole someone had put in this car somewhere in its 40-plus-year-old history. The body manual didn't indicate a seal at the top of the door, but I decided to put one. So that's my approximation of what Toyota originally did. Using a blade, I cut a hole for where the courtesy light wires would need to poke through. Once that was done, I smoothed out the plastic and then carefully placed it on the door. Just enough to be taut, but not too much tension at all. I cut out the hole for the door latch. And then I just cut a cross pattern over the window crank and then squeezed it through. One door clip was partially occluded, so I just cut around that hole. It was fine. Gaff tape comes off pretty easy, and then I just trimmed the top, and there it was. So basically, this is just putting it together in the reverse order that you took it apart, but there's a few tricks I learned. Like, connect your battery to make sure the courtesy light works before you put everything back together. And score a couple more holes for the ones you forgot to do when you put on the door card. I lined up the door pretty well, but one wasn't perfect and the clip fell out. Fortunately, they're pretty easy just to slide back into place. Attaching that horseshoe-like clip onto the window crank was the most tricky part. What I found is if I took a pair of tweezers and kind of half installed it on, I could prime it, so when I put it on there, I could take a trim tool and just snap it the rest of the way into place.
Got it.
Did I?
I think you got it.
It's totally on. Can't pull it off. Good job.
This next part sucked. You would have thought this would have been the easiest, but I swear, that brittle plastic, I thought it was gonna snap. It was just fidgeting for 5 minutes to get it to sit. But then it was smooth sailing from there. It was amazing doing this without breaking anything.